I would like to welcome everyone, or welcome you back if you were with us this morning, for our final session of this Humanities Council webinar on people, politics, and representation, produced by App TV Special Events. Dr. Elizabeth Bellows, a Humanities Council member and Associate Professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction, will introduce and facilitate our final session, and I will hand things over to her now.
Thank you, Nancy. We're excited today to invite Michael Roth to join us. Michael Roth is the 16th president of Wesleyan University and the author of Safe Enough Spaces, a Pragmatist's Approach to Inclusion, Free Speech, and Political Correctness. Formerly president of California College of the Arts, Roth is known as a historian, curator, author, and public advocate for liberal education. A professor in history and the humanities since 1983, Roth was the founding director of the Scripps College Humanities Institute in Claremont, California, a center for intellectual exchange across disciplines. In Safe Enough Spaces, Michael S. Roth stakes out a pragmatist path through the thicket of issues facing colleges today to carry out the mission of higher education. With great empathy, candor, subtlety, and insight, Roth offers a sane approach to the noisy debates surrounding affirmative action, political correctness, and free speech, urging us to envision college as a space in which students are empowered to engage with criticism and with a variety of ideas. Please welcome Michael Roth.
Thank you very much. It's good to be with you virtually. I was looking forward to visiting with you in person. We made these arrangements a long time ago, it seems like, as everything that pre-COVID seems like a long time ago. And thank you for joining us here today. I know you've had an interesting program this morning, dealing with issues that are complex and highly charged, and central to how we are thinking about education and the humanities and campus life today. So my topic, Safe Enough Spaces, was conceived originally as had nothing to do with a pandemic. It has to do with free speech and intellectual diversity. But it undoubtedly some of us will be thinking about safety in different ways today than a year or so ago when this book came out. It's a little book. It looks like it looks something like this, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen if I can here. Let's see. Here we go. And I'll toggle back and forth between the slides and no slides. But I thought I'd give you a sense of the trajectory for my remarks this afternoon. And the headline there is that how do we go from a procedure-based approach to encouraging participation of people with diverse identities and various points of view. Procedure-based approach is the approach that many folks use who think of themselves as classic liberals. That sometimes that puts them on the right today, or they're called conservatives. But people who think that the only way to guarantee free speech is to not have any restrictions on it. And so they have a procedure-based approach, I think. I think that it's wrong, and I'll explain why later on, or at least it's not good enough, and then talk about what I see as the important role that universities have in creating a conversation in which people from diverse backgrounds and with diverse points of view feel heard, acknowledged, and taken seriously. So Safe Enough Spaces, maybe I should say a word about the title, which my wife, Kari Weil, kind of helped me with. And Safe Enough Spaces is a joke in a way. It refers to a psychoanalytic view of parenting in the 50s, we used to talk about we used to talk about good enough mothers. And a good enough mother was a mother that didn't make you psychotic, that didn't make you crazy. And that became good enough parents when the analysts realized that father's also a parent. And it's somehow commonsensical, I suppose. I mean, if the parent who tries to make their kid perfect, who tries to get rid of all stressors, all anxieties, all things that might cause psychological disturbance, such a parent is going to drive their kids crazy. On the other extreme, the parent who says, well, I want my children to learn the laws of physics, so I have them play in traffic. That's also not a prescription for a good childhood. So what the analyst said is you want a good enough parent, a parent that wouldn't make you crazy. And so in all the hubbub about safe spaces a few years ago, I thought, well, it's not like people want dangerous spaces, but I do think almost everybody really wants a space that they consider safe enough, and there'll be real divisions about that enough. What constitutes that, but I think that one should strive for spaces on college campuses in which people are not subject to intimidation and harassment, so that they feel safe enough to encounter difference, even offensive points of view. So that's the headline. The book has 3 parts. When I was a student, I was a student at Wesleyan many years ago, and I took a seminar on Hegel with Victor Gurevich, who's a great scholar of Rousseau and an extraordinarily gifted teacher of philosophy. And Victor seminar on Hegel had a big impact on me. So the rest of my life, I think I've been categorizing everything into 3 parts, and this book is no exception. The first part is from affirmative action to inclusion. The second is about political correctness. I call it the use and abuse of political correctness. It echoes back to Nietzsche's essay on the use and abuse of history. And then the last part is free speech and intellectual diversity. At the end of my remarks, I'll say something about the importance of moving from the kind of environment on campuses I'm talking about to civic engagement or political engagement beyond the university. Because as we get here to mid-October, before a really crucial election, I think it's part of the responsibility of colleges and universities to encourage civic preparedness. And that civic preparedness today means participation in the electoral system. And without such participation, it seems to me that our students would not be prepared for their civic or public lives. So let me walk you through some of the argument. I'm a historian by education, I guess. My work before I became a college president was mostly around how people make sense of the past. My first book was about psychoanalysis and history. And then I did a book on French Hegelianism and the ways in which the deconstructionists and structuralists and post-structuralists all were reacting to the investment in history made by Hegelians in France in the 20th century. And then I turned towards issues in trauma theory and theory of history. But I always take a historical approach. And in this book, the first section is really asking a historical question, which is, why do we go from emphasis on affirmative action and diversity to today an emphasis on equity and inclusion? And I I was driven to this because as a college president, I actually hired our first vice president for diversity. We had a chief diversity officer, and now I have a vice president for equity and inclusion. And Wesleyan is like a lot of schools in this regard, whether it's a vice president or not. Going from somebody who is in charge of ensuring that the application pools have people from various demographic groups, that your campus matriculants have include people from various demographic groups. From there to emphasis instead on inclusion. So that historical trajectory interested me, even just the changes in the nomenclature interested me. And the other thing that interested me is that, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, but most of the people I knew who were in favor of diversity on campus, they were not so comfortable talking about affirmative action. Nobody really wanted to talk about affirmative action. And I asked myself, why is that the case? And then a few years ago, about 5 years ago, I wrote a piece that I published in the Wall Street Journal that called for an affirmative action plan for conservatives on campus. It's a little tongue in cheek, but guaranteed to offend everyone. And my friends on the left were offended because they said I had sullied the words affirmative action by connecting them to conservatives. And I was like, you didn't like the words affirmative action to begin with. Why? What do you mean sullied the words affirmative action? And they said, well, we may not like the words, but you shouldn't use them in this context. And so I was very curious as to why we stopped talking so much about affirmative action and start talking about equity and inclusion. So I'll toggle back and forth so that you're not always looking at a slide, because sometimes the slides they're not that dynamic. All right, so here we go. I think one of the reasons is it's just at places where affirmative action is under a lot of pressure, at highly selective places, it's impossible to win an argument about why some people got in, they deserve to get in, and others didn't. Now, I'm at a small place. We have about 3,000 students here at Wesleyan, and we accept under 20% of our students typically, the people who apply. You know, the affirmative action cases at Harvard most recently, or the University of Michigan years ago, or UC Berkeley before that, these affirmative, or Davis, UC Davis, those are cases were about, well, Harry didn't get in, but Jane got in, or Malcolm didn't get in, but Joseph got in, or and when you look at the different people, the person who didn't get in was certainly as qualified as many people who did get it. Right? I think that's important. There'll be debates about this, whether the woman who sued in Texas actually should have gotten in or not. Was she as good as student? I actually don't think you can win those arguments, because at a place like Wesleyan, again, a small place, small place, I would say 75 to 80% of the people who apply could get the average grade here, which is a pretty good grade, you know, B+ at least. 75 to 80% of the people who apply could, if they got in, would do okay, would do fine. Now, only 18% get in. So it doesn't mean it's totally arbitrary, no, but it is under the rubric of a holistic admissions process, which we have. There's just a lot of judgment calls that could have gone the other way. Jess Sulingo, a talented journalist about higher education, has a new book out about who gets in and why. And he goes through the machinations of different admissions offices of trying to decide when we have 5 people who they all look great, they all could get A's, and you can only take one of them, let's say, or 2 of them. How do you make that decision? I just don't think that you could ever show that the meritocracy is really a meritocracy in the end, that these people are the ones who really deserve to get in. So the other piece of this that I think that I've noticed over the last several years now is that the students who do get in and may have benefited from affirmative action don't want to be identified that way. Obviously, I suppose they feel like a Black student at Wesleyan may think that the white student looks at them and says, you got in because of affirmative action. They may not have at all, right? They may have gotten in because they're better than half the other people who applied or who got in. But that the notion there was affirmative action gives some folks the ability to stigmatize others. The other thing that I noticed was that many of our students from underrepresented groups felt as if we had admitted them in order to satisfy our own affirmative action consciences or criteria. So people said things to me like, you only admitted us here because you want to put us on the website. You want people of color on the website. And this I hear at many highly selective places. You took us in because you want to feel better about yourself. These are historically white institutions, these highly selective places, and they've historically been, let me put it euphemistically, very challenging places for students from underrepresented groups to feel they can thrive. And so the students themselves were telling us, we don't feel included. So colleges and universities around the country started to develop offices of inclusion. So because they felt that although they were admitting people from a variety of demographic groups, and although they were enrolling people from a variety of demographic groups, that they weren't actually helping those groups thrive. Though people from those groups just didn't feel they were full and equal citizens of the university. This is hard to measure, right? Full and equal citizens. How do you tell? Well, one of the things you could ask people, do you feel fully included at your institution? And I in Safe Enough Spaces, I talk about a report on equity and inclusion that the Harvard faculty put together, probably now 3 years ago or so, and it's a some 70-odd page report, and the words affirmative action only appear once. And I think it's a footnote about compliance with federal rules about equal access. But the words thriving and inclusion occur, more than 18 times. And I think it's because schools want to figure out, and rightly so, campuses want to figure out how they can be environments in which all students can thrive. Not just asking students to come and conform to a paradigm of student life that was created for, let's say, white men at these Ivy schools or highly selective schools. Now, at public institutions, I think it could be quite different, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk about this if you have questions about it. But that the shift to inclusion seemed really important to me. On the other hand, it's hard to feel included if you're not successful at the institution. By which I mean, if you go to a classroom and you say to the professor of biology at a place like, and almost all non-religious schools, if you go to the class of biology, you say, well, I don't actually think evolution is true. I believe in story of creation as told in the Bible. The professor is probably not going to actually try to refute the Bible in class, but the professor may just dismiss you as having a view that's not relevant to the study of evolutionary biology. If that happens, you may not feel very included. If you go to a class in economics and you relate the kind of economic theory of your grandmother or something, I don't know, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense to the professor, and they tell you you're wrong, you may not feel that included. When I went to college, again, a long time ago in the 70s, I was a first generation student, I suppose. I mean, my parents didn't go to college. So when I got there and I handed in my first paper, and I was so excited to be told I was smart, because the high school had told me I was smart, and the professor told me, you don't know how to write? You know, get some help with your writing, Mr. Roth. I thought, I don't belong here. That's what I thought. I don't belong here. All these fancy people from their fancy private schools, they belong here. I don't belong here. So the professor wasn't telling me that because he didn't think I belonged there. We became great friends. He actually became my dissertation advisor many years later at Princeton. He wasn't telling me that, but I felt, because I was criticized about something I cared about, that I didn't belong. And so at the end of this chapter on from affirmative action to equity and inclusion, I discussed this tension between critique and inclusion. You know, because if the goal of the professor is to make everybody feel included, you're not going to give anybody a bad grade. You may not tell anyone they're wrong. Now, that doesn't give you a professor license to be disrespectful or even dismissive. But after all, if you wrote like I was writing in my freshman year of college, I needed to be told. I was pretty thick. I needed to be told bluntly that you need to get help with your writing. In our era, where parents are often very involved in their child's education, you tell that to a student, they go home and tell their parents, then they call the dean, and you know, my daughter doesn't feel included, or my son doesn't feel included because he's been criticized. And so there's all these tensions. When you move to equity and inclusion, there's still these tensions about what does it mean to be included in an environment in which you also want to be an environment of intelligent critique. So let me just go on to the next section of the book, which is about political correctness. So this first section sets up the campus culture as a place where we talk about wanting diversity, then talk about wanting diversity to lead to inclusion, but then experience the tension between inclusion and critique. One way of resolving the tension between inclusion and critique is to not criticize people, to allow for a kind of conformity to grow. That conformity gets called political correctness in the last now 30 years, really, more or less. And so in chapter 2 of Safe Enough Spaces, I give a historical account, again, of the words political correctness, how they came to have the meaning they now have. I was very interested in this trajectory because in the period between the two world wars, the words political correctness were used mostly by Marxists and communists to talk about whether someone's political practice conformed to the theory of historical change and radical potential for revolution that was prevalent on the left. And so that was how the words were used. And then among lefties, among communists and Marxists, they were used as some kind of banter. Oh, you know, Vladimir is not politically correct because he thinks you should go on strike before the consciousness has been raised to an appropriate level of revolutionary action, or something like that. And then even this lingered on until the 1960s and all, where the people on the left would use it with one another to chide someone for not living up to the theory, or, and here's the new left part in that first bullet point, that to chide someone for trying too hard to make their politics conform to a theory. So in the 60s, the new left, especially in the late 60s and early 70s, the New Left rejected having your politics grow out of abstract ideas because that seemed itself like a kind of conformism. And so among leftists, people, especially young people on the New Left, would call their older, more doctrinaire comrades, they call them politically correct, meaning that they were conformists, really. Yeah, they were conformists, and it was a kind of gentle but meaningful criticism, and then I talk about a debate in feminism in the 70s where two Black feminist poets get into a kind of almost poetic dispute about, do you want to be correct? Is it wrong to want to be politically correct? Because, or that, if you're going to be creative, does that mean you have to be incorrect? You have to be breaking the mold. So I talk about that to some extent, but the words politically correct really get charged in a way that resembles how we're using them today. After Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind. Now, Alan Bloom, and I spent some time on that book in Safe Enough Spaces, because it's such an interesting phenomenon. It's an interesting book in some ways, but it's a very interesting phenomenon. I think that that Bloom wrote a book about how historicism, like the use of history to make meaning out of the world, led to a kind of dismissal of truth, because every age is supposed to have its own truths. So if every age has its own truths, then everybody should be respectful of everybody else's point of view. If everybody is respectful of everybody else's point of view, then nobody's really seeking a higher point of view or the real truth with a capital T. And Bloom said that's what's happening at colleges, that everybody has the religion of respectfulness. They have the religion of, he calls it relativism, that everybody has the right to their own opinions, except if you think your opinion is true, that's taboo. You have to have a kind of automatic tolerance, he said, and that Bloom says that the tolerance of the youth culture, and he's writing in the 80s, but he's deeply scarred by the 1960s, and he had been at Cornell during the campus takeover, and but he thinks that all of this radical, pseudo-radicalism, all of this political progressivism, it's all conformity. Progressivism is making people conform to a view they don't even understand. And Bloom he just hated youth culture. he liked some, I'm sure, his students, but he hated youth culture. He hated the music, he hated the clothes, and so the part of it, The Closing of the American Mind, is a kind of rant, really, about the young, which is, I think, embarrassing actually for people who work in academia. I mean, it's if you don't like your students, you should find another line of work, it seems to me. But Bloom didn't that. He found a way to write. He wrote a bestseller. I think everybody was shocked it sold so well. And it set a template for complaints about what I call it, complaints about kids today, like the old song from Bye Bye Birdie, the kids, what's the matter with kids today? Bump, 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 that they don't listen to us. Why can't they be like we were, perfect in every way? What's the matter with kids today? So that you see come into the 90s and to our own day, right? That complaint, what's the matter with kids today? Spiro Agnew made it in the early 70s, Bloom in the 80s, and then Roger Kimball does Tenured Radicals. In the first edition, he hardly ever uses the words politically correct, I think maybe once. And then I think in the next edition, over a dozen times. Then there's Sousa, and they just come out of the woodwork, all of them hoping to sell books like Alan Bloom. Some of them, most recently, John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff's book, the Coddling of the American Mind, right? I mean, they just take the title and put in another word and hope it sells. And it did sell because middle-aged people love to complain about young people. and that they're conforming, that they're coddled, that they aren't like we were when we believed in free speech, or when we were open to ideas. And today the kids from the 90s until our own day are said to be too eager to conform. So the words politically correct, the first President Bush gave a speech against political correctness. Bill Clinton gave speeches against political correctness. And as did the second Bush presidency, and even Barack Obama, not long ago actually gave a talk about political correctness and cancel culture, saying, that the young people today are enforcing a kind of conformism or conformity, and that is political correctness. And it gets so easily used. I mean, President Trump, he was the king of it, right? I mean, when he was asked about, I think in a primary debate, remember Megyn Kelly, she asked him a question about the language he uses about women, which is just pretty horrible. And instead of answering the question, he just said, political correctness is killing our country. And so that becomes this great, anytime you're said to have done something wrong, you say, oh, but you're just being politically correct. So I've written a lot about this. Some of the opinion pieces kind of get morphed into this chapter, but I think there is, of course, a pressure to conform on college campuses, as there was in the 50s and the 60s and so on. But I don't think that complaining about youth culture is the best way to educate the young. I think that finding a way to reach young people and to turn them, to use an old-fashioned term, to turn them from the things they're most familiar with and most comfortable with to other kinds of things is our job as teachers. That's why we're professors. But the song about political correctness goes, not only are the students likely to be conformists, not only do they enforce a kind of doctrinaire leftism, let's say, on one another, but that their professors indoctrinate them into this narrow way, these narrow ways of thinking. And that's becomes a critique of the faculty. So Bloom was really criticizing the students, but by the time you get to the 90s, and actually there was a movie made by some Wesleyan grads in the 90s called PCU, Politically Correct University, which was modeled on it was a spoof about activists at a place like Wesleyan. But they say that the professors contribute to this because the professors are too eager to try to placate their students. Now you can see how this ties back to the previous chapter, because the professors are trying to have their students feel included, so they cater to the preconceptions of students instead of challenging them. And then the professors are said to be indoctrinating students, especially in the humanities and social sciences, indoctrinating students into a leftist ideology that is closed-minded and incapable of hearing dissent. Now, some of this I think is based on the old-fashioned kind of fears of change. That is, as you get to be an older faculty member or administrator, you don't like to be told you shouldn't use that word, you should use this word, or don't refer to me with that pronoun, but with this pronoun, or this. And many people have a different point at which they roll their eyes, that is, why are you so sensitive? And they roll their eyes. But the people who are doing the eye rolling, of course, are the people with power and, dare I say, privilege. And so I'm not that, I guess I'm not that interested in just the inability of people past a certain age to adapt to what the mores have how they've evolved to try to be more inclusive of different kinds of people. I don't spend very much time on that. I am, however, interested in what I think is that there's a grain of truth in this description of political correctness. And that is that in many colleges and universities, and I don't know the situation at yours, but at many colleges and universities, the humanities and social science faculty is seriously tilted to the left. And I was not really aware of this or didn't think about it because I share those views really. And so I didn't think too much about it. But at some point I became friendly with someone and asked him to join our board who was seriously on the right. Well, he was a libertarian, so not exactly not that kind of right-wing person, a libertarian. And he kept pointing out to me the places in which we just assumed a kind of progressive, what we thought of as a progressive worldview, but that these assumptions were just that. They were just assumptions. And there are other ways of thinking about the same issues or opportunities for addressing problems. And so when I started to talk to my friends and colleagues about this, I found real defensiveness. So people would say things like, well, yeah, we have only, let's say, leftists in this department, but we can teach conservative things and we don't need to hire someone who's conservative, which reminded me of like the early days of women's studies when men would say, well, I could teach women's history. We don't have to hire women. We hire the best person. But the best person happens to be a lot like me. And I scratched my head. I'm like, don't you guys hear yourselves? You're saying we don't need to broaden the faculty's composition because you're comfortable with people who make you comfortable. And so I do think there's an issue there that political correctness weaponizes, to use that phrase, but that is a real issue for colleges, for many colleges and universities, not for all, but for many of them. So that brings me to the last chapter of Safe Enough Spaces, which is, as you see from the slide, about free speech and intellectual diversity. Because I really became concerned that my students in my classes weren't getting exposed to serious traditions of conservative and religious thinking. And I was concerned that they weren't getting that in many other departments either. And I don't expect the people in astronomy to teach, medieval versions of the planets or to teach astrology or something. I don't expect, of course not. But I do expect people in philosophy, in intellectual history or sociology and literature to look at enduring traditions of conservative and religious and libertarian thinking around issues related to the subject matter of the course. And I found that that wasn't happening nearly as much as I would want it to as a professor or as a university president. Now, the answer to that, this is why the title here is Free Speech and Intellectual Diversity. The answer to that is suggest, well, you just have a free speech problem. And I said, no, I don't think it's a free speech problem. I don't think it's about the procedures we have for guaranteeing speech. I think it's a curatorial problem. I think it's up to the faculty and the leaders of the administration on the academic side to curate conversations and curriculum so that students get exposed to things we think are important, which is not the same as a free speech problem. It's a quality of speech problem. So this last section of the book deals with these issues. And I start off with a critique of procedural approaches to free speech, which is what I mentioned in the very beginning of my remarks. That is sometimes called the absolutist view of free speech is a view that that more, what all we need is more speech. Just open the gates wider and everything will be okay. And the marketplace of ideas will take care of everything else. And I don't think that this is an adequate way of educating students. And I don't think it's an adequate way to think about the economy either, that like the marketplace is really important, but it's not the only important thing in developing an economy or a society. And so I spend some time on, sometimes they're called the Chicago School, or people who really say that colleges and universities just remove all restrictions on speech and it'll take care of itself. I actually think that there should be some restrictions on speech, that speech that causes harm, that is harassing or intimidating, should not be permitted, if the law allows, on colleges, at colleges and universities. And I wrote this at a time when there are these kind of right-wing entertainers that were being invited to some campuses that couldn't restrict access, and they came to basically, throw tomatoes at some people, make fun of disabled people, make fun of queer people, make fun of, a whole, and I understand that public institutions have different legal responsibilities in this regard, but a hero of mine, when I was a young faculty member in Claremont, I started my teaching career at Scripps College. A hero of mine was the then president of Pomona College, David Alexander, who I'm told, I actually don't know the veracity of the story, I was told at the time, found out that a group of neo-Nazis were using a conference room on the campus in Claremont, which is perfectly easy to believe because in Orange County, not far from Claremont, there were a lot of such groups. And David Alexander said, tell them to leave. And the lawyer said, you can't tell them to leave. They rented this room. They had a very innocuous name, Revisionist Historical Society or something. And he said, let them sue us. We are not going to welcome Nazis and say, well, it's okay because it'll take care of itself. Truth will take care of itself. And I actually think that was the right call to make, and that today we have to make those kinds of judgment calls. And people say, well, if you do that, then you're gonna start squashing speech left and right. I actually don't think that's the case. We have rules. Even the absolutists have rules about some things you can't do. You can't incite violence. You can't promote child pornography. You can't. Everybody has a limit. Stanley Fish makes this point again and again. I think we have to have reasonable limits. Now, what's a reasonable limit? That's up for discussion. We should talk about it. We should not just say everything goes because everything has to go. Otherwise, it's the Soviet Union. Many countries do have democratically established limits, and their public speech arena is at least as healthy as our own. And so John Milton, has always brought out this great defense of free speech. That we have to hear opposing points of view, but he said that's not for Catholics. Them we extirpate. He had his limits. John Stuart Mill had his limits. We have to be aware of our role, I think, as educational institutions to encourage learning, and that means we have to curate the kind of discourse we are supporting on colleges and college and university campuses. And that's why I wrote this piece about an affirmative action program for conservatives. The conservatives said to me, we don't need affirmative action, we just need the marketplace of ideas. But that's not true. In the marketplace of ideas, they're going to get shot down because the prejudices of the hiring committees, they'll just never hire someone. They won't invite those speakers. We have to actively broaden the ideas that students are going to encounter. So I was able, this person I invited onto the board actually made a very nice gift to Wesleyan, so we could establish a visiting professor who would come from these traditions. I have someone now at Wesleyan teaching courses in history and religion, We have a fellowship also for a retired military officer to come and teach classes for us, although it doesn't mean they'll be conservative. This person who's here now certainly says, I'm not the colonel is here now that says he's not conservative, but it does create a broader mix. And he gave us some money, the same donor gave us some money to establish a lecture series. And I think it's gone pretty well. I mean, you always read about, especially when I was writing the book, one read about these places where speakers were shot down and they weren't allowed to finish their talks and all that stuff. I don't think that's a good thing. So we established a speaker series. We brought in, but not kind of celebrity conservative types, but scholars, serious folks in the Thomist tradition or Aristotelian tradition or libertarian tradition. But there was one person I did recommend because I knew him a little bit, and he was written several books, an academic, but had become quite conservative, and he came and gave a talk. So I went to this talk because I knew the guy and I had recommended him. And my wife was supposed to go out to dinner with us afterwards. And as I'm walking to the talk, I thought, do I hope there will be people there, or do I hope no one's there? Because, we had all these stories of students shouting down speakers, and Wesleyan students are rather rambunctious in this regard. I get to the room, it's packed. So I'm both distressed and pleased that he at least drew an audience. We gave a terrible talk. I just thought it was intellectually lazy. Students sit there, listen, and then each question, boom, 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 they just kind of demolish the argument. And at some point, my wife leaned over and said, I'm not going to dinner. But the student sitting behind us raised his hand and said, I just want to say if this is what President Roth means by intellectual diversity, I think we should be able to do a lot better. And I was a little embarrassed, but I was very proud of our students that they could engage with a combination of intellectual vigor, but also listen carefully to the argument being presented. And that seems to me to be indicative of what one wants in a classroom and on a campus. One wants spaces that in which one can encounter ideas different from one's own. One can have one's worldview shaken, but one doesn't have one's humanity questioned. One doesn't have one's identity attacked. And so the argument of safe enough spaces is that we should find ways to encourage a broad spectrum of ideas, intellectual diversity, in order to facilitate transformative learning. And so, people say, well, why would you want transformative learning? Why do you need the safety? Where does the safety come in? And I think the safety comes in, because in my own lifetime, I've seen, gay students and queer students, viciously attacked on campuses. I've seen women students just hit on by the faculty members or not taken seriously by teachers or by their peers. I've seen students from other minority groups treated shabbily because of their race or their ethnicity, or because of the professor's view of their identity. And so I don't think we should allow that. I think we should try to find ways in which everyone feels safe enough to open themselves up to the kind of learning that will force a reconsideration of their ideas so that they leave the university with more powerful tools for dealing with the enduring questions that they will confront about forgiveness and love and equality, and the contemporary questions they'll have to confront, like forgiveness, love, and equality, and healthcare and climate change and all the rest. I call this a pragmatist approach because I don't think that these there's a formula that allows you to answer the question, how much free speech can we have? I don't think there's a formula that allows you to answer the question, how much intellectual diversity should we have? I think that is a product of conversation, deliberation, and iterative decision-making. You try something and then you try something else again. Now, I have just a couple of last remarks to make, and then I'll see if you have questions for me. I've kind of gone on a long time, I guess. It's clear that safety today in many places, and in your school, of course, a prime example now of how do we keep safe from this awful pandemic. And you know, there's just so many failures in this regard in the United States. It's really saddening. Unfortunately, we've seen the politicization of public health in really counterproductive ways. And you know, what we needed, we had an opportunity to bring the country together in the face of a terrible enemy, and to marshal resources for testing, tracing, and supportive isolation. You know, it's actually not rocket science. It's not easy to do. It's expensive in some respects, but it's far worse to have both politicized responses to the virus and not mobilized a national consciousness around public health, which we had an opportunity to do in March and February of this year. Colleges and universities are thrust in the middle of it. I mean, you at Appalachian State more than most, and sadly so. How can a university community serve public health, and how can public health serve a university community? Instead, we're treated to the spectacle of colleges and universities being like the poster children for bad behavior, right? So there's an appetite to show college students at bars, college students on the beach, you know, people doing all these things that put their health at risk. And you know, I've talked to a lot of reporters about this over the last 6 months, and you know, the New York Times now, they run on the one graphic is the number of cases and deaths from COVID, and the right next to it is the number of cases at colleges, as if colleges were the most important thing. Most Americans at 20 years old don't go to college, as you know, and so I'd love to know. I don't know the answer to this. I'd love to know. Is it more dangerous to be 20 and not in college? It's not as if there's no risk. I mean, we know there are risks on campuses, but it's not as if there are no risks when you're not on campus. And so I think we've just bungled this crisis in ways that we still haven't reckoned with. I mean, the numbers of deaths are unnecessarily high, the number of infections unnecessarily high, and since we're in an election, that will be taken as a political statement rather than just an obvious public health statement. More to the point, can schools keep students safe with this tripartite approach? I know they can. I see it. Now, it takes money, and schools spend money on other things. Some schools don't have money to spend. I do think this is a governmental responsibility to protect young people at educational institutions. We were told at Wesleyan and schools like us in the Northeast that in order to keep our students safe from the spread of the virus, we would have to test twice a week, because that's what it would take to keep, when somebody got sick, and people would get sick, for that, you know, for them to keep them from spreading it to too many people, so it got out of control. Now, a lot of places don't have the money for that, but of course, if we had a national mobilization to get people tested, and so if you were asymptomatic, you would still not spread the disease because you knew you had it and you were at supportive isolation, it would have made an enormous difference. At Wesleyan, we have one active case right now. We have, as I say, 2,500 students, 700 employees or 900 employees getting tested regularly. We've had a few cases, and we've been able to isolate those folks, and so that doesn't spread very far. Now I say that, and I'm immediately knocking on my table here because we're halfway through the semester, and it's a very fragile equilibrium, or so it feels to me as a university president. I'm looking out my window at the campus. I live right here in the middle of the campus with my wife and our daughters here right now. And I do think colleges should be able to preach the gospel of safety, if I can put it that way, and that we could know what safety means in the context of this crazy moment in our history. Speaking of that, the last thing I'll say, and then see what questions you have, is that in the last year, I've created something called E2020, which is a program to develop civic education through participation. And this is to take the safe enough and to move it into the public sphere. There are 3 principles for E2020. They're pretty straightforward. That civic preparedness, it's a phrase I think I've stolen from Daniel Allen, who's a political theorist at Harvard. Civic preparedness is a core element in the mission of American higher education, and most schools that I know have something like civic preparedness in their mission statement. So that, and then that participating in American political life helps students learn from various kinds of people and ideas, and to develop a practice of citizenship. That's the habit of citizenship. And then that empowering students and teachers to engage with complex issues. It's how we contribute as higher education to the common good. So, the first thing, civic preparedness is good for schools, it's good for students, and it's good for the country. The idea here was to get schools, and we have, I think, a few hundred partner institutions ranging from small HBCUs and Christian colleges in the Midwest to big public schools like UC Berkeley, to big private universities like Northwestern and Duke, and community colleges, and I had dreamt that we would get thousands of students out in the streets and knocking on doors and getting people to vote, basically. And so instead of having my students complain about politics and complain about politicians, to get them out there working on a mayor's race or a congressional race or a state senator's race or the presidential election. Of course, I don't tell them which side to be on, it's up to them. But of course, COVID made my little fantasy of political engagement less relevant, although students around the country are engaging virtually with one another or through letter writing and texting and other ways of trying to stimulate participation in what feels to so many of us like an inflection point in American political history. So students don't have to feel safe to do that. Like if you're knocking on a door and to talk to somebody about why they should vote for candidate X, you don't know if they're going to, yell at you or agree with you. You want to feel safe enough to do it, but not so safe that you only go to the houses where people agree with you. And that seems to be a metaphor for all of the stuff I'm talking about. We want a democracy where you feel safe enough to get into a conversation with your fellow citizens, but not so safe that you know exactly what they're going to say, but not so worried that they might just take out a gun because they don't like you. And right now, of course, we're not in that world. A lot of people don't feel safe enough. But I think part of our duty as educational institutions is to create such a world. And that's what I'm trying to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Such an interesting take on this idea of political correctness. We do have some really great questions in our Q&A. And so I hope that we have maybe time to answer 2 of them. So I want to start right away then. Is there a way, and this is a student, I believe, is there a way to open up conversations that students bring up to get to the more personalized attachments to the schema and what intentions they really have? So this student says that sometimes in class, I think I have a good point, just a minute, but what naturally comes out of my mouth is a slurry of basic ideas. Then when professors reject my idea entirely, I look for why I'm right rather than the deeper parts of the issue. So are you aware of any classroom models that can help us progress through these thoughts?
Thank you. That's a great question. You know, I think the model classroom for me in this regard is just a teacher who can hear what you're trying to get at, even though you haven't said it. You know, and all of us teachers online, we've been there, right? We've been in a class, and we've all been students like that too. You know, I still, when I raise my hand at a public lecture, like you just did to ask me this question, I raise my hand, I still get butterflies. You know, maybe I'm going to sound like a jerk. and what you don't want is a speaker or a professor who's going to say, you know, you sound like a jerk, and here's why. That's so easy to do, actually. What you want is a teacher who's going to say, you know, maybe you're trying to say, or maybe that's such an interesting thing. Maybe you're trying to get at, and then the student says, you know, I think I am trying to get at that. Or maybe they say, no, it's a little bit to the left of that or to the right of that. And I think that as a teacher, creating a classroom where you can explore without being right. And that's what we all want. We want students, as teachers, we all want students to take a risk and say something that may be wrong, because that will lead to a better right, better rightness. And I think those are the kind of classrooms people have to feel safe enough to do that. I mean, I had a teacher who I love who used to say things like, you know, have you read something on stupidity or something? But some of us raised our game and some people just left, actually. But I think a great classroom is one in which everybody finds a way to get smarter by making mistakes along the way.
Great, thank you. This is something we've also noticed at our institution, a real shift, right, in language and how we're moving to this idea of equity and inclusion work, right? And this is something that's come up, especially I think in our current political climate. The question is, can limitations to free speech, i.e. hate speech, be effectively implemented without inadvertently targeting specific groups of people?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I'll give you a couple of examples. Some years ago now, a group of students came to see me, African-American students, and they wanted me to punish some students who had set up what they called an affirmative action bake sale. I don't know if you remember this. It was going around the country where people were selling cupcakes. Students were selling cupcakes in the student center. And if you were a person of color, you paid a lot less than if you're a white person or something, just to make the point that they were different criteria for different races. And from the perspective of the bake sale organizers, this was wrong. And we wouldn't accept it for a bake sale. Why should we accept it for college? So the students came to me, this is racist. I don't feel safe in the dining room. I said, well, you actually are safe in the dining room. And you can argue with these people. I'm not going to tell, this is political theater. And, you know, if I use, I don't agree with them, but that's neither here nor there. That's very different than, you know, I'll give you a kind of strange example. We had a speaker out in just a public square here, and she had bodyguards with guns on their shoulders. And Connecticut is an open carry state, but we don't allow guns on campus. Now the speaker was a pro-choice speaker, you know, so it wasn't your normal constellation of you know, gun rights and other things. And so I told my dean of students, you go out there and disarm those guys. I'll be here in the closet. No, and so they could have said, well, it's our free expression to carry guns. We said, no, not on our campus. We think that's intimidating for people on our campus. And so when they put their weapons away. And so I think you can try to set examples of the kind of discourse you want, and banning things, I think, is a last resort, but sometimes necessary in order to show the constituents of your community that you take their lives seriously, that their lives matter to you. And if somebody's coming and saying that certain parts of your student body shouldn't be allowed to be there or shouldn't allowed to exist, I don't think you have to entertain those speeches because they're acts of intimidation.
Great, thank you. We have a couple more minutes. I want to go back to this idea of the evolution of political correctness to address this next question. How's the evolution of political correctness similar to the evolution of identity politics in the public and government spheres? I wonder if you take that on in your book.
I do to some extent. I talk a little bit about Mark Leela's last book, which dealt with identity politics and liberalism. I think that I think that the history of political correctness is not just about identity politics, though. I think it's about cancel culture isn't just about identity politics. It's about ostracizing people with views that you don't want to hear, and so that you don't hear them. And I don't think any identity group has a monopoly on that. I think that the critique of identity politics in the United States is interesting for me insofar as it aims to show that more coalitions are possible and that coalitions are necessary for effective politics. Coalitions beyond, let's say, just one focused on one's identity group. But critiques of identity politics that are just angry that I don't get, as a white man, I don't get to hang out with, I don't know, the anti-rape feminists at lunch because they're going to sit together, they don't want me there, or I don't get to be with the African Americans because they don't want me there. That kind of critique of identity politics, I don't have a lot of patience with. I think these are groups of people who are building up resistance movements against histories of oppression, and that they create their own forms of solidarity. And I'm not always welcome to that as an old white guy. I'm not always welcome. That's okay. I think that it becomes not okay when if a group is so closed that it's not open to the kind of coalitions that would make its politics more effective. But I don't think that identity politics and conformity or political correctness are inextricably linked.
Thank you, Michael. We really appreciate your time today and for sharing this unique view on this shift from political correctness to diversity and inclusion. I know we also have an inclusive excellence structure in our university through our Center for Academic Excellence. And so we have been wrestling with a lot of these issues ourselves. And so we really appreciate your time today and for coming and talking and answering some questions. I'm going to turn it over to Nancy to close our session today.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and especially our speakers and panelists. This has been an intellectually and stimulating series of discussions. And I want to thank as well Sonia Wilson of FTV. And Sonia, can you appear briefly so that we can give you a virtual hand? So, without her expertise producing this webinar, it would not have happened. So thank you so much. And then last, if you enjoyed this webinar, please watch for future Humanities Council events, visit our website to learn more about our work. And if you can, make a donation for future programs. Our programs are free, but they're not without cost. And then last, I was struck by something Jennifer Hirsch said earlier today, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was along the lines of, as academics, they teach you to produce information, but not how to do anything good with the information you produce. So in that spirit, I just want to thank everyone again, and to close saying, may all of you be well and do good in these challenging times. I think all of our speakers have exhibited how to do that. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks very much.